Hi, I'm Tweez Conrad. Reptile pets are the fastest growing part of the pet industry. True chameleons are the most popular of these reptile pets. But there's an unfortunate side to having them in your care. They die. Recently, I had the opportunity to speak with Mike Fry, Reptile Rescue Coordinator for Animal Ark. Please join me as we enter the world of these fascinating creatures. Hi, we're here today speaking with Mike Fry about chameleons. Hi, Mike. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I've heard that chameleons are one of the most difficult animals to keep in captivity. What can you tell us about that?
Well, they are very difficult to keep. But before you understand why that is, it's probably kind of important to understand a little about wild chameleons. When I talk about chameleons, I'm not talking about the little green or brown lizards we've seen in pet stores for years. I'm talking about a whole different group of animals that look more like this little beanie baby here named Rainbow.
Oh, pretty.
They tend to be large, although there are some species that are very small. They're very slow moving and have a prehensile tail, which they can use almost like a fifth limb for hanging on to things. And for the most part, they're arboreal, meaning that they live high up in the trees of the rainforests. And most of the species of chameleons come from Madagascar. Because they live high up in the trees, they're not adapted well to drinking water out of, puddles or pools, so they've adapted to drinking water that's falling like rain.
Right.
So, that can be a challenge to try to recreate that in captivity.
Yeah, I would imagine. How would one go about recreating their natural habitat? Is that nearly impossible?
Well, that's a challenge. Chameleons are, because they don't have any real defense mechanism other than camouflage, they tend to live very solitary lives and are very easily stressed. Any big thing that moves near them they think is a predator that could eat them. So they need, a large open space. Even though they're slow moving, they still need a lot of space with lots of heavily planted enclosure that they can feel secure and protected in. Lots of branches that simulates, the tops of trees.
Right.
And then you put drip systems at the tops of the cages that will, drip rain. At my house, for example, I've got an irrigation system that runs through all of the cages on a timer so that for an hour every day it rains in the cages. And then there's always the challenge then of what do you do with that water? You have to collect the water, obviously, and get rid of it somehow, too, so that you don't have mold and mildew. And
it sounds like something for the advanced pet owner.
Yeah, they're widely regarded as expert-only reptiles to keep.
Tell me about their diet, Mike. What do these chameleons eat?
Well, in the wild, they would eat probably thousands of different species of insects, small vertebrates, including other small lizards, small mice. Some of the larger chameleon species will even eat birds. So a very diverse diet. They'll also eat some fruits and vegetables, so a very diverse diet.
Right.
And in captivity, obviously, with the challenge then is to try to recreate that, and it's almost really impossible because with store-bought insects, you're pretty limited to crickets and mealworms. So the only solution to that is really to try to breed your own insects. And so, in fact, I've brought some examples of some of the insects that people breed on their own if they're keeping chameleons. This here is a walking stick. A Vietnamese walking stick.
It looks like a stick.
Yes, it does. And you'll notice it's a fairly good-sized insect, and actually the walking sticks will get quite a bit larger than this even. So they can make a nice hefty meal even for a larger chameleon. And when they first hatch, the walking sticks are very small, so even small chameleons can eat them. So that's really important, and they're also very nutritious. So you can feed these a variety of leaves and leafy vegetables. Another insect that people oftentimes feed are different species of tropical roaches. This here is a nymph of a Glabrus giganticus.
Oh, boy.
And
jumpy.
And they get, this is again a nymph, so he's young, he's not full grown yet, so they get quite large.
Potato bug.
And the nice thing about them is they can't climb glass or plastic, so they're easy to contain. Here's a quick shot of the adult if you want to see once they've grown their wings. They're very, and some people think they're pretty even. Because they come from the tropics, they require very warm temperatures in order to reproduce. So they can't get out and infest your house, which is one of the nice things about keeping them.
Well, what happens if they can't eat their rainforest diet like this, or if somebody doesn't know how to breed these
well,
insects?
people who feed exclusively crickets and mealworms usually lose their chameleons very quickly because they die of all sorts of problems related to nutritional deficiencies. So the diet is really important. Other insects that they can breed at home include silkworms, waxworms, a variety of different caterpillars, mantids you can get.
Right. Tell me about importing chameleons. What is that trade like?
Well, it's a very dirty business. And it's best summed up by a friend of mine who sent me an email fairly recently. Richard visited importers in Florida recently, and he personally observed more than 1,000 dead chameleons of various species.
Oh.
So it's a very dirty business. They're very delicate, so trying to collect them from the wild, move them through the exporters who are in Madagascar, to the importers, to the wholesalers, to the pet stores, it's a lot of people who have to have their hands on them in that process. And to give you an idea about the monetary incentive for doing it, I've got this little magazine that I brought through. This is actually the New York Times magazine from a couple years ago. They did a story. The title says, "I was caught in Madagascar, peddled for 30 cents, smuggled to Orlando, and sold for $10,000. I'm a rare, coveted tortoise." And while we're talking about chameleons, the issue with chameleons is very similar to what's described there with the tortoises. You can buy chameleons on the street in Madagascar literally for pennies.
Right.
And because the people who buy them don't spend a lot of money for them, there's little incentive for them to provide proper care for them. So they don't set up proper housing, proper watering, proper nutrition. And so it's cheaper to just let some of the animals die and try to move them through that import-export chain as quickly as possible. And so most people say that by the time the animals get to the pet store, most of the ones that have been collected have already died. So it's a very dirty business.
Is there any sort of legislation protecting the import of chameleons at this point?
There's very, very little. One thing that does protect them currently is their current CITES status. And CITES is the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species. All camellia species are on Appendix 2, which is the threatened species list. And but that does not ban them from import in and of itself. Because Madagascar is considered such a threatened habitat, and 33% of Madagascar burns every year to make room for its growing population. And so people studying the issue are concerned that because chameleons are being collected out of a smaller and smaller remaining area of Madagascar, that we need to really watch them closely. So they've banned the export of all but 4 species. That doesn't prevent the protected species from coming in, however. Exporters do all sorts of sleazy things like labeling illegal species as legal species and hoping that people who are inspecting the shipments won't know the difference, and oftentimes that is the case. So smuggling takes place pretty rapidly.
What about the Humane Shipping Act?
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has recently proposed humane shipping regulations that currently protect mammals and birds, but do not provide any protection for reptiles. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed that those humane shipping regulations also be applied to include reptiles, because they recognize that these are gentle, intelligent, beings that we need to protect.
Oh, of course.
When they proposed that regulation, the pet industry pulled out both barrels and has fought them aggressively, and at this point it looks like that legislation will not be passed.
Wow, so it is big business.
It is. And it pays little attention to the well-being of the animals at all.
Right. Well, thank you, Mike, for being with us. You've been very informative, and is there anything else you'd like to tell us?
Well, I would like to say that it's not all bad news, because, people can make a difference. If people see chameleons or other reptiles or exotic pets that just are not appropriate pets for most people, and they see them for sale in pet stores, don't spend money in those pet stores. Don't buy dog food from those pet stores. Write letters complaining about the conditions in which they're sold, and support organizations that are working to make a difference. The World Wildlife Fund has got a number of conservation projects going on to conserve habitat in Madagascar, which is probably one of the most important things to do. An organization that I'm a member of is called the Chameleon Information Network, and they publish a quarterly journal all about these fascinating animals. And even if you don't keep them as pets, it's very interesting reading. And the people who publish this travel regularly to Madagascar, and you can learn all about their trips and what's going on in conservation topics. And of course, they can support Animal Ark too. We're one of the few shelters that actually works to rescue these animals, when they're in bad condition in the pet trade.
Right. Great. Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Come back again.
I will.